All right, so we're going to pivot to the moderated Q&A portion. And what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to turn off one of these screens. Let's see. PC, right. Yes. So come on down, all the speakers. Please come on down. And Greg, if you don't mind, you might want to move your chair to the right of Liegh, because the projector might be in your eye. I don't want you to get blinded. So, and if you want to do you want me to bring that table with you?
Did y'all enjoy that? That was a good way to start the day, right? And let's give D'Angela a nice round for consistently doing this and believing in the purple spirit. Thank you for bringing us here. Thank you. Yes.
Cool. This is like following James. Like Mick Jagger backstage.
Right. The Tammy show.
Smoking them cigarettes.
Welcome to America.
Yeah. I love it. So thank you, D'Angela, for always giving me the best panel. A lot to unpack. Really appreciate it. I don't know, are we going to do the Minty thing at the end, or we're just going to kind of...
Yeah, we're going to do the Minty, and I'm going to bring you here we go. I'm going to bring you this iPad, if I can use my words, and I will set it up so you can actually see them. But you're going to start off with questions,
Sure.
and I'll bring it to you.
Man, that's fantastic. So thank y'all. I'm Greg Howard, King Rim. I'm a producer, musician. This is my second symposium. I always get the best panels. So much to unpack. So I'm going to try and get a lot in and just around the questions and kind of go in order of the presentations.
Yes, and I forgot about our live streaming audience. So for those of you who are just checking in, if you want to add some questions, it is menti.com, MENTI.com, and the number is 3119-7505, 3119-7505, and it is menti.com, MENTI.com. Got it. Awesome.
I should have emailed softball questions.
Excellent. So I know we got a lot of musical experts here, so I don't have an ego at all, so correct me if I'm wrong. So we're going to jump right into 777-9311. Excellent presentation. I loved it. Just so much surrounding that song because I believe it's the actual first Prince LM1 actual single, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, like a couple months before Nasty Girl, I think.
Yeah.
All right, so we have the Dave Garibaldi from Tower Power programming Into the Machine, which up until 10 years ago, everybody thought, Prince, put in those scattering hi-hats. And that opening funk rhythm at the beginning is actually played on a $100 Hondo Telecaster that belonged to Des Dickerson that Prince actually just picked up. So I guess my question to the panel is, we talk about how important that song is. Like, what do you think was in the identity of the time that made Prince say, this belongs to the time, and not, because Prince actually has those braggadocious songs, those, party songs, hey girl, what's going on? What made this fit the time so appropriately, in your opinion? You going first, Declan.
Well, to be honest, I've been thinking about this over the past couple of days, actually, and because we know there was the rivalry between, so it may have been him, because as I said, we say it was basically a stock rhythm pattern in the machine. It could have been him almost saying to the group, let's see if you can play this, almost, because, and Jelly Bean knocked it out of the park, so it may have originated from that kind of, because there are loads of quotes, we've talked about it a lot today about, the band being the only band he feared, and so that may have been a kind of him putting them through their paces and seeing, pushing them to see what they could do, and they did it, so.
Excellent. And Christopher, so with the brand strategy part, what do you think was in the Times dressing room, going off of what Declan said? Like, we're underpaid. Prince put us together, but we don't get the input with the writing. Like, what's going through their mind, you think, before they're hitting the stage with that kind of attitude in that kind of challenge? Like, what do you think they're talking about amongst themselves to step up to that challenge?
Oh, Jesse made that very clear on Questlove's podcast. They were pissed. Every single time they hit the stage, when they really put on those shows, they were upset with Prince. So the best way to really sort of play that through was to show out on stage, because you can't just go somewhere and just say, I'm irritated with you, you get on my nerves, I can't deal with this right now. But the best way to really show that you are irritated with somebody is to take all your frustrations out through your craft. So once you get on that stage and you see how they just whipped and how the steps are all tight and how the licks was just going and the chops were there, that was them literally playing out how irritated they were at the moment. So they knew if they, it's kind of like that kill them with kindness theory. So instead of just going out and just being all pinned up, bottled up, and letting their frustration just kind of showcase through their energy, they put it on the stage and just made it work. So while we're sitting here like we're up in the air, jumping up and down, screaming and shouting, excited for what was going on in that dressing room, they had literally already had argued before they hit the stage. So that's literally all that you saw was just the performance playing out through the irritation.
Right. And they ultimately won because they got kicked off the tour,
consistently.
Right. And so, Karen, with the idea of that Pygmalion creation, it's almost like AI, like when the creation takes some. Yeah, I care for my iPad's listeners, but like, what do you attribute to like that creation taking on a life of itself? Like, where does that spark generally just kind of come from? Like, when does it become conscious in a sense of its own kind of autonomy? Speaking of the time.
I mean, I guess when they got kicked off the tour, right? And they really realized that this was their band, and they took it. And I mean, I'm still kind of like that 777 talk. I love that because looking at the lyrics, I was like, yeah, that is a Prince song with the idea of consent and all the questions. is that all right with you? Only call you after if you say I can, that stuff. And that's all Prince, but they delivered it, and they had, like you said, the choreography, the steps, the groove that you cannot sit still to. And I think you're right, like that frustration, and whether or not that was intentional on Prince's part to get them going. I don't necessarily think so, but that's up for debate. We can talk about that. But I think that is an interesting situation because this was also like his first of many side projects, right? That kind of went in this very iconic place on his own tour and everything. Like Vanity 6 didn't do that, right? But the Time for sure did, and we see the emotion that comes through with that. Yeah.
Excellent. And Liegh, let's talk about that self-actualization part, taking that from Karen. Like, the Time works because they actually believe it. Like when you talked about Muhammad Ali, and some of those characters that they're pretty, but they can back it up. And not a black character, but like in professional wrestling, Ric Flair, we love those characters because it's like, man, it's aspirational. Like, they're pretty, but they get in and get busy. So can you talk a little bit more about that self-actualization in that, the concept of the What Time Is It album, the tour, 7/7, 7/93/11, and being able to actually genuinely deliver that, that kind of bravado?
One of the things we learned late, that those of us who were listening to Prince early, so a lot of people post around the world in a day, or when he was going through the things with Warner Brothers, people were like, and particularly a lot of the white fans were like, how Prince get black all of a sudden? Right? But if you had always been listening, there were cultural indices in the lyrics. There's one I really want to say, but it's really crude and I just don't want to say it. But if you, there's a, and again, this is just one, because this was happening in our neighborhood. The Let's Work extension, right? The line he says, such, wet, let's make you soft and wet, my dick and bubblegum is all you get. That was a staple adolescent black kid thing. Every dude I knew said one or two things. It said, you turn down some sex, play, I don't turn down nothing but my collar, that's it. And the other one, and bubblegum. And so it was like those kind of indices that run through that. So that when we get later, and Prince's, quote, becoming black. No, he was always that. So when we get to things like Dear Mr. Man and I'm trying to remember the one on the Gold album, We March, right? Which he gave We March to Minister Farrakhan for the Million Man March. Yeah. And there's a clip with Minister Farrakhan. So that self-actualization, Muhammad Ali. Right. Prince has long said Muhammad Ali was one of his biggest idols. Yeah. So that self-actualization came from The Way, right? The Way was a social political outgrowth. And so it was always there. Like I say to people, if the Rainbow Children threw you for a loop, that's because your ass wasn't listening. Right. And so if Black Power Prince threw you for a loop, that's because your ass wasn't listening. So the time was always designed to be a manifestation of the Black Power ideology that he knew he couldn't use to cross over, but he was sending a message to those like, hey, I ain't going nowhere. This is my anchor into the community, but I also need to do some other things because I not only have to show white people that we're human beings because we have more slices in our pie chart. He has to even show black people. Because under the mantra of white supremacy, self-hatred caused us to limit ourselves. So the time and what Prince was doing was widening our own humanity. I should have.
I'm about to tune up. Benediction. Straight up. So, man, Liegh, thank you for that. And so I love about this panel, we just have these phases of what Prince was doing at this time. 1982, this is like the precipice before that very sweet spot, that 83 to 88 output. And I think, Declan, you touched on that. Christopher, you touched on that. Just that outpouring of creativity. And I think this Time album like really kind of set it off. And I think the Lindrum specifically was like that too, that where he can just cut it on, program it, plug it in, and get busy. If he wasn't going to play live drums or have Morris do it or Jelly Bean and Bobby Z. Declan, can you talk a little bit more about just like some of the sequencing on the album, which you kind of alluded to in your presentation, like with it ending with I Don't Want to Leave You, starting with Wild and Loose. Like, how does that flow? And do you think that was purposeful? And what did it like kind of achieve with the sequencing of the album?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things about sequencing is talking specifically about 777 is the fact that the Lindrum beat actually starts mid-measure. So it starts, so the single version begins with that displaced kick drum beat, but the actual version that's on the album, because it is immediately segued from Wild and Loose, which ends abruptly, actually starts mid-measure with the two kick drum beats that appear on the two. So that also again, as I said in my presentation, also throws a sense of rhythm off as well. But overall, the sequencing, I think the second side is slightly more reflective in a way, because you end with Gigolo's Get Lonely Too and then into I Don't Want to Leave You. Right. But even then, compared to, I think, the sensitivity and the I'm trying to think of the right word, but that's a different kind of emotion than he's expressing on 777. It's a different kind of flavor. But I think the album sequenced incredibly, and I think because it opens with the two longer songs, I think it helps to have that shorter, because One Day I'm Going to Be Somebody is under 3 minutes. Right. It's 2 minutes 30, and then you're into The Walk, which is then almost 10 minutes long. So I think it's wonderfully broken up the longer tracks with the shorter tracks, and yeah, I just think it's a perfect album, I think.
And can I add something to
that?
Yeah,
please. I was going to you next. So
when you think about I Don't Want to Leave You, the very last song, when you listen to the acoustics of that record, it literally takes you into what 1999 was going to be sonically.
Yes. Yeah.
And then what's beautiful about the last few scales of that song, just the way the drum patterns sort of switch, that's what Jam and Lewis was using on all those Taboo records, right, or any of those productions that they were doing around that time. And then when you think about it, I Don't Want to Leave You, I want to be monogamous, I want to be here, but then 1999 comes, I want to dance the night away while this whole nuclear war is going on. So you kind of see him going from this whole space of, I want to be loyal to someone, but then the hedonism sort of kicks in because this whole sort of situation is going. So when you talk about sequencing, I think actually what time is it is actually somewhat of what 1999 would be a continuum of, so to speak. So I think it was actually brilliant sonically when you think about it, because the whole pattern of drumming on that last song sort of sets the tone for what 1999 would be and eventually what Jamie Lewis would do.
Can I say something about those two
please,
songs
please.
too?
Yeah.
And coming out lyrically, when you look at One Day I'm Gonna Be Somebody and I Don't Wanna Leave You, those are very complex images of black men. The kinds of complex black images that wasn't associated with the physical imagery. And that's intentional, because if you go to any hood in America, sisters are not afraid of the thugs in their neighborhood. Sisters are one who go talk the brother off the ledge. Sisters are one who go talk the brother from doing whatever. They are black. So Prince understood in crafting these images to be true to his community. These had to be three-dimensional characters. The one thing about the time is that they're not flat and they're not one-dimensional. And then what's great about One Day I'm Gonna Be Somebody, here's what's really great about that, because it's the setup is they poking fun in a new way, right? That's the setup. But check this out lyrically.
Okay. No.
It's a perfect time song, because the difference between the personality and of the time and the Prince don't give a damn about making somebody proud. The whole thing, and one day I'm gonna be somebody gonna make my mama proud. Prince was such an individualist that he wasn't caring about he couldn't have sung those words. There was nothing about Prince's individuality at that time that was interested in making people proud, because he understood for him that kind of notion of making people proud was going to confine your freedom and your ability to create who you are. And so we have to see then, even in constructing the time, he's being very intentional about three-dimensional blackness. I'll shut up.
No, please.
Don't ever do that.
Thank you for that. That's excellent. So we got some questions from the audience that kind of coincide with some of the questions I was going to ask. First, Karen, we got some questions about your shoes. I don't know how we can incorporate that in. You might want to put up a story, some posts.
I bought these in Paris because, as I mentioned, I teach French, so I get to go to France a lot. So, and that's why I kind of like to. That's actually how I got into talking about Prince in this sort of scholarly way. It goes back to the 2017 Manchester conference where I met D'Angela and so many of these amazing scholars, and I needed to get funding for it, and I was like, how can I connect 19th century French literature with Prince? And it worked. I said he was a dandy, and then I got funding to go, and then it sort of developed. But then I was like, well, you gotta rock the gold shoes. And then these are also, I can dance in them, and I think that's like incredibly important at a time show, right? Sure. With the music, like you have to have like the ability to do the Running Man or the walk or the bird or whatever it is for the entire 40 minutes, nonstop, sweating, and that's what I'm all in for. And that photo is actually from a private party where I was the only person on the dance floor to the time. It was wild, and I was like, well, I'm gonna do the bird. Here we go. So very weird experience, but anyway, ties in with the shoes.
Great shoes. That was an actual question, and I actually want to stay. I want to stay with Christopher and Karen in this kind of brand foray of this time, and we talked about Jimmy and Terry, these excellent members of the time. Monty, what about the control element didn't work for Prince? Like, why not revisioning this, saying like, man, I see Jimmy and Terry doing all this great stuff. Why not keep them within the Purple Kingdom and have it be more of a synergetic democracy? Like, what about that couldn't work? And Christopher, I'll start with you, especially with your presentation. Like, why wouldn't that have worked for the brand? If somehow Jimmy and Terry are working with Janet, SOS Band, Sherelle, and have that all kind of flow up through Paisley. Like, why couldn't that work at that time?
I think it was just the fear of giving away that sound. because at that point, you know, this was relatively new stuff that was hidden the audience. It was new to our ears, and it was new to radio in many respects. And so when you think about someone who's literally on the cusp of being the big thing, they don't want anything to disrupt that pattern or to disrupt that flow and that energy. And I think the biggest thing was, you know, these guys could potentially be bigger than him at some point. And in many respects, in certain parts of the 80s, they were. Because think about when Control dropped, that shifted sounds again. Yep. And before you got New Jack Swing, you got that record. Yep. So a whole different trajectory in music was coming just off the strength of these guys literally being studio rats, but literally sort of having their own sort of identities in there. But I think the biggest thing was he was just fearing that they would eventually be bigger than him, get more credits, and then, of course, royalties and all that stuff. We know how that stuff works. Don't nobody want nobody messing with their money. But I just think a lot of it was just fear of superstardom and just fear of them really sort of surpassing him in many respects.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, like this idea of being limited by fear and ego. Yeah. And we have to remember, I think like sometimes we get so far away from like Prince's actual biography, and like he was not even 24. Like he was a very young man who like did he ever have a real job? Like, you know, he's been this genius musician since the beginning, and with this incredible work ethic, and that's all he spent his time doing. So he was, you know, he was part of this very dynamic community in North Minneapolis, but also like this is also an ego thing. You know, I put that in my presentation. I didn't really talk about it explicitly, but the Narcissus Greek myth idea of narcissism, because Morris mentions that in his memoirs as well, and I thought that was like interesting in the context of this mythology idea I was going with. But I definitely think like this fear, like you're talking about, but that's also like a young man and not being able to check his ego and not having that maturity yet, you know. I
get that. That's like saying like, why didn't New Editions and the Beatles stay together? You know. Please, let's come to you next.
I'm glad you said. Being in a group is the only job where everybody thinks you're supposed to be at that same damn job the rest of your life. Like, those are the only people that we get mad when they quit their job. Athletes can go to different teams. Executives can go to different corporations. Solo artists, but don't your ass lead no group.
Solo artists can lead to go to the label.
Solo artists can lead. Yeah, but so and when you think about it in that way, and I mean, it was my father. My father was like, I remember I was talking about, because I remember when the Time broke up, and I was kind of like, and you know, Pop, the Time broke up, and he said, because they grown ass men. He said they grown ass men that was stuck together 8-10 years of their life. He said, I don't want to see my brothers every damn day. That's why your uncles don't come over to the house all the time. So I think that we forget the Time was a super group. Right. Let's be real clear. And they were a super group before they were the Time. Yeah. Right. And I think that, so when you mention, it's like, it is natural that people with all that talent, just like all of us go to different jobs, and we have different friends, have different stages, but it's because the music that they make is so impactful to us. Right. We define them as something else other than being human. Correct. And therefore we hold them the standards that we would not hold any other human being. That's it.
Man. So shouts to the Four Tops.
There you go.
All original four members.
There you go.
And I think
the only four.
I think the Eagles do it.
Yeah.
You know, they pull themselves together to come together and do it. I want to go back real quick to 777. I know we're talking a lot about that just because it's such a great record, and I think it's emblematic of the album. We're going to talk about some other things on the album, if time permits. But I want to talk about the questions part, Declan, like the idea of kind of, we're coming back to you on the call and response, though, but the questions to me always sounded like more like the suggestions of a very confident guy, like, damn, baby, can't you see the agony I'm going through? Why don't you just, you know what I'm saying? Like, give me your note. Am I, you know, can you speak to that just a little bit and the coy nature of how it's being delivered in the context of saying Morris meeting a young lady at a party or something like that?
Yeah, well, as I said in the presentation, I think the striking thing about, because I think what is quite fascinating about 777 within the context of the album is almost as much what's not there as opposed to what is there. because as I said in the presentation, it is very much of a piece with The Walk and Wild and Loose in terms of these extended jam songs on the album. But as I say, it's the only one of the three that doesn't feature a female voice. And I think that's quite noteworthy. Celine talked all about the song Grace in his presentation. And I think you could very easily see Grace being the second half. If you cut out the guitar solo, you could very easily see Grace being the second half of 777, which would include a female voice into the mix. But the problem with Grace, and I think possibly this is why it was eventually omitted, because it is essentially, Grace is essentially a skit. Right. And it is not out of place with the skits that are on The Walk or the back end of Wild and Loose. So it is peculiar that it's not included as part of 777. Right. And I think the reason for that is because it's the emotional landscape of Grace is Morris sort of reclaiming that confident persona you see on the other tracks. Yeah. So I do think that it is, you can certainly read the lyrics as a begging sort of, kind of tone, but I just think it's incredibly fascinating that there aren't any female voices in that song. He basically has, on the B-side of the single, which wasn't on the album, another half of the song that basically essentially destroys my presentation because it kind of completely undermines my thesis. But again, I think it's fascinating that it's not there. And also there is that tradition in R&B music of splitting the song across both sides. So why isn't Grace 777-9311 part 2? Because it could be, but it's not. So there is a distinction between Grace and 777, and I think that does kind of amplify the unanswered questions in the song more than, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I would say, I don't think it...
But before you go, can you include this in your response real quick? It's kind of like not like a self-destruct, but like the 777, right? And then there's Gigolos Get Lonely Too. So you go out and you do this only to be a lonely gigolo after you succeeded with these conquests. So please include that.
So I don't think it destroys your presentation, because I think one of the things that Grace does is that's a different type of female archetype. That's a professional, right? Whatever we feel about Grace, Grace is a professional. She's a journalist. She has a job. She has respectability. She can tell him when to start talking, when to stop talking. There's no other woman on there. So I think the second part of it is still about Prince thinking conceptually about the images he wanted to create. And so it does speak to what you're saying about Prince is thinking about, right, these types of notions of what are black men, what are men, what is masculinity. And so I think that Grace becomes a great back end or bookend to put Morris in a position that the other women on the album don't. He at least has to meet an intellectual equal. Now he's going to win because he started the show, right? But so Grace is the only intellectual equal. So I think you could argue and raise that the fact that the only way that Prince is saying the only woman that could get a woman like Morris Day is an intellectual equal. And then if you play it all the way out, in On Time, what does Morris say? Who saves him? Intellectual black women. He says that his wife, his mother, his sister, and his wife all save him. Grace saves him. And so Gigolos Get Lonely Too is him realizing, I need a Grace. I need to listen to my mother. I need to listen to my sister. I need to listen to my wife. So being vulnerable. And so that Gigolos Get Lonely Too, again, is Prince crafting, thinking about we are not flat, one-dimensional beings. And it's important because I've always theorized that in doing that, Prince is not just talking to white folk. He's also talking to us, because a lot of times, even as black people, we'll start making stuff, oh, that's that white folk stuff. Right. Or you doing that white, I was in high school, 14 years old, 1983, and my own friends would tell me, you got Kiss and such on your locker, that's white folk music. And I had to tell them, like, you do know who the hell Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Ike Turner and Rocket 88. So Gigolos Get Lonely Too is it's also Prince setting up the mantra, which was his duality between the physical and the metaphysical, that the metaphysical is always more important than the physical. And to prove to you that the metaphysical is almost always important than the physical, I'm going to let you see a hard, straight-laced black male like Morris Day who's going to testify that the metaphysical is always more important than the physical.
Yeah, see, Liegh, man. And I,
All right.
Oh.
We are actually at the end.
I'm sorry.
Because it's noon and it's time for What Did Prince Do This Week? And we only have an hour. So we want to give a very special thanks to Greg Howard, who is our amazing moderator, and the incredible panelists, Declan, Christopher, Karen, and Liegh.